servers. And I will come back to how you may write the path here in the next lecture. Another way of using router link is with property binding. So you can enclose it in squared brackets. And now, of course, you can't just pass /users here, because this would now search for a property with that name, which would even be an invalid name in JavaScript. So now you have to pass a string here with single quotation marks, or better, an array, which gives you a more fine-grained control over router link. And I will come back to this later when this is especially useful. Here in this array, you now specify all these segments of your path as elements in this array. So the first segment in this case is only a string /users. And if you had /users /something, you would have a second element here, which is then just something without a slash. The leading slash here is only needed to make this an absolute path, and I will come back to this in the next lecture. For now, I will get rid of this. Now, this array notation is not super convenient, but soon you will see when it really gives you an advantage or when you need this notation. It allows you to construct more complex paths very easily. So with this, we set up our free links using router link, either by passing a string or this array, which allows us to define our individual path elements. With that, if we save this and have a look at our application, now you see it still reloads, or it still gives us the components, but it doesn't reload the page. If you watch this reload icon, nothing is happening there, because router link catches the click on the element, prevents the default, which would be to send a request, and instead analyzes what we passed here to the router link directive, so this path or this array of path elements, and then parses it and checks if it finds a fitting route in our configuration, which it of course does, because we defined all the paths we're using here. And this is how we can navigate around with the router link, and this actually is how we should navigate around, because it gives us the better user experience, it doesn't restart our app, therefore it keeps the app state, and it's much faster than reloading the page all the time. You can, of course, still type something here manually, so that will still work, but if you're inside of the app, using router link is much better. In the last lecture, we added this navigation, and I also mentioned that you can change the way you use your paths here. Right now we use /servers, or even with this more complex notation, we have /users as the first element. Now what happens if we just use servers here like this and just use users like this? Let's save this without the leading slash. Now if we click there on our links, you still see this works absolutely fine, nothing changed. Now let's go to our servers component template file here. And for now, let's quickly add an anchor teller element here, where we also add a router link, where I add servers again. Reload page would be a fitting description. So on this servers component, I now added this router link, where I basically want to make sure that I stay on the servers page, which I'm already on. So if we go to servers here, we see the reload page here, and if I click it, you see we got an error. This error here occurs because it doesn't find a route which is servers/servers. Now this error won't occur if on the servers component I turn this to /servers, so to an absolute path. It was a relative path. Here, if we now have our console still open and I click reload page, nothing occurs here, no error occurs, because now it simply navigates to localhost 4200/servers, as you can see down there. And if we turn this back to a relative path, the difference was that now it tries to go /servers/servers. So with a relative path, it always appends the path you specify in the router link to the end of your current path. And important here, the current path depends on which component you're currently on. That is why we could remove that in our navigation, where we also use relative paths, because that is on our root component. This component is not loaded through the router, so this root component always sits at localhost 4200/nothing. So this is always at our root level, which is why we can use relative paths here too. But one layer below that, once we loaded a route, for example the servers component, this page is only loaded if we are at /servers. So if we add a relative route here, this will now get appended to this route we're on, so it will try to load servers/servers, and therefore it gives us an error in our case because we haven't registered a servers/servers route. Now, of course, using relative paths inside of active components, active routes, might be a nice thing if you have nested routes. Right now, it will only break the app though. Now, you can also use relative paths with // at the beginning. This is the same as having nothing there. And you can even navigate around like in a folder directory. You could add // which means go up one level, and then add this to the path here. Now, if we do this inside of our servers component, you will see if I hover over this, now it again only tries to load /servers, and therefore we don't see an error. Because now it first goes back one level, which basically is to just our root path, so it removes one path, and important path depends on the route you're on. So if you were on servers/something, and this would load this component, it would remove both. So this does not necessarily only remove one segment here, it removes the currently loaded segment, you could say. So in this case it removes this and then adds /servers again, which is why this works. And this is how you can navigate around absolute paths with a / at the beginning, which will always get appended to the root domain, relative paths without a / or with // which means added to the currently loaded path, or // and you can even add more of them, to say, well, go back one path, go back another path, so always seen from the currently loaded component on. And if that is something which is not 100% clear, you will see it throughout its module, but also feel free to play around with it, add your own routes, add some nesting, add more complex paths, and see how this works out. But for now, let's continue with our application. I will remove this reload page link, and let's enhance this a bit more. We of course added navigation to our page, but one issue is that whilst it does work fine, we get no visual indication of what the currently active route is. It would be nice if this selected tab would change, and that of course is only a CSS thing. Because if you check your app component here, you see we got this active class on the list item, which determines whether this is marked as active, if this link gets the right CSS classes or not. So it would be nice if we could dynamically set this class. I will remove it from here, and how can we now set it dynamically? Angular gives us a specific directive for this. The router link active directive. And the convenient thing about this directive is you can add it to a wrapping element like we do here to the list item, or also, of course, to the link itself. And it will attach the class you specify in between here, for example, active, so this should be a string, to that element it sits on. Now, active on the link itself wouldn't do anything when using Bootstrap. Here, for this tabs look, we need to add it to the list item, but this of course depends on which package or which CSS code you are using. And here you could specify any class you want, like my active class or whatever that is. So here it is active to make it look nice in Bootstrap's world, and I will add it to all my links here. So now theoretically, all my links should receive this active CSS class once they are clicked or when they are active. So if we have a look at this, it seems to work because we still have home set as our active page, even though we removed this class, this active class we had there before. If I click servers, it gets marked as active too, and the same for users, so this works. But somehow home is always marked as active, so that does not seem to work correctly. What's wrong here? Well, the router link active directive does one thing. It analyzes your currently loaded path and then checks which links lead to a route which uses this path. And by default, it marks an element as active, it adds this CSS class if it contains the path you are on, or if this link is part of the path which is currently loaded. So for the /servers link or the /users link, this is of course the case once we click servers or users. For the /nothing link, which is the first one, the home page, this is always the case. We always have /nothing at the beginning of our path here. So if we are on /users, well, there is this empty path in between, you could say. The same for servers and the same for just home, of course. So the empty path segment is part of all paths. Still, we don't want to have home being marked as active all the time. So to fix this, we can add some configuration to this router link active directive. And I will just split this up all over multiple lines to make this a bit easier to read. So we can add a special configuration to our router link active directive. So on the same element as router link active was added to, we can add router link active options. And this now needs some property binding because we don't just pass a string there. Instead, we pass a JavaScript object, and that would not work without having our squared brackets. So with squared brackets, we can pass anything which will be resolved dynamically, like this JavaScript object. And here we can basically add one important configuration, say exact, and set this to true. So exact is a kind of a reserved property on this object you pass to router link active options, and this will now basically tell Angular only add this router link active class, so this active CSS class in this case, if the full path is, well, whatever this link leads to. So only if everything is just / and not if it is only part of the path. So with this in place, now you see it still is marked as active on the empty path at the starting page. But if you go to /servers, now only servers is marked as active because now we fixed this, we changed the default behavior to make sure we only mark this if the full path is, well, whatever we have on our router link. Whoa, we already covered quite some things. We learned how to add routes and how to load them, either by typing it manually into our navigation bar here or by clicking some links. We also learned how to style these links. But what now if we wanted to load a route programmatically? So we don't have a link the user can click, but we finished some operation or the user clicked some button and then we want to trigger the navigation from our TypeScript code. We can do this. Let's say in our home component here, I add a new button to it. And on this button, I simply want to load the servers page. So here, now we could try adding router link, but let's say I want to have a click listener and execute some method because we do something else than just navigating there. I will also add some CSS classes to make this button look nice. So on this click listener, I want to execute onload servers. And here, this method now gets implemented in the home component. And in onload servers, I simply want to navigate to the servers component. So we could, for this example, of course, also use a router link. But let's say here we have some complex calculation, or we reach out to our backend, we store something on the server, and once we are done, now we want to navigate away. To do so, we somehow need to get access to our router, this Angular router, because we need to tell it, hey, please navigate somewhere else. The nice thing is we can inject this router. So let's bind it to a private property, maybe we name it router. And this will be of type router. Router needs to be imported from @AngularRouter. With this injected, we can use this router here. So this router, and then we get a couple of methods there. One of the most important ones being navigate. Now navigate takes an argument which allows us to, guess what, navigate to a new route. And here a route is defined as an array of the single or the different elements of this new path. So just like here in app component, where I also explained this alternative way of binding router link, binding it to an array, where you could have users for the users part of your path, and then another element for maybe something for the something part of your path. Now you always have to pass such an array when using the navigate method, but in here still the first element is simply the first element or the first segment of your path. So if let's say we want to go to /servers here, we could add /servers here. And as before, this is now an absolute path. You could have a relative one, but here you have to control to what this should be relative to. And I will come back to this. So for now, let's make it an absolute path here. And once we did this, let's check our page here, click this button, and we go to servers. So this is now programmatically routing to a different page. Still, it doesn't reload our page. It does the same as if we clicked a router link, but with this router navigate method, we are able to trigger this programmatically, so trigger this in our code. In the last lecture, we learned how to navigate programmatically. Now I want to also have a look at how we can use relative paths there. So back in our servers component, let's say we have again our reload page link, but this time it's a button here with button primary, and still we might use this approach because we want to do some different things. So reload page, and here I will have my click listener on reload maybe. So if we now go to our TypeScript code, here on reload will be the method which gets triggered. And we already inject this service here. I also want to inject the router. So let's add router here. Make sure to add the import from @AngularRouter. So we learned that now we could say this router navigate, and now let's add /servers here. If we do this and we save this page and we go to the servers page and click reload, nothing happens. We don't get an error because we are already on this page. Technically it still reloads the page, but keep in mind it never sends a request, so this reload icon will never spin. But Angular simply determined that we are on this page, so no further action is needed. Now let's say we remove the slash at the beginning, so we turn this into a relative path, and we still are on the servers component, keep this in mind. So now if this reloaded and we click this page, we still don't get an error. And now this might be strange because before, when we used the router link, you saw that we did get an error because it would try to add servers to the end of this path. And of course this route now doesn't exist. So why does it work fine if we use the navigate method? Because unlike the router link, the navigate method doesn't know on which route you're currently on, so to say. The router link always knows in which component it sits, in which component's template, and therefore it knows what the currently loaded route is. Now you could argue that here we also call this inside of the component TypeScript code, so it could determine where it is in, but it's just not how it works. So to tell this where we currently are in, we have to pass a second argument to the navigate method, which is a JavaScript object, and here we can configure this navigation action. Now I will come back to this later because there are more things we can add, but one configuration is the relative to property here. Here we define relative to which route this link should be loaded, and by default this is always the root domain, which is why we didn't get an error for this servers path. Here we have to give a route though, so we don't pass a string here. Instead the route is something we can inject here too. We can get the currently active route by injecting route, which is of type activated route, and make sure to import activated route from the @AngularRouter package too. Now activated route, like the name implies, simply injects the currently active route. So for the component you loaded, this will be the route which loaded this component. And the route simply is kind of a complex JavaScript object which keeps a lot of meta information about the currently active route. Now we can set this as a value, so this route, this injected route, for the relative to property. And now with that extra piece of information, Angular knows what our currently active route is. And theoretically, you could also set this to some other route, which you would have to get by some way. So here we're telling it, now our currently active route is this activated route. So relative to this route, you should navigate. And then it will simply resolve all the relative paths you might have here relative to this route. So with this change in place, if we now click this button again, now we broke the app because now it again tries to find servers/service, which doesn't exist. So great, we broke the app. But with that, you should understand how you can work with relative paths in the navigate method. You define relative to what this path should be loaded. The default is the root URL. That might be the behavior you're looking for. It might not be the behavior you're looking for. You can change it with this extra JavaScript object, second argument to the navigate method, where you have the relative to property you can set to the route you want to navigate relative to. For now, I will simply comment this out to disable this not working button and still keep the code in this example project. With the basics about routing set, let's enhance our application a bit by going back to the app module and adding some other routes to it. Let's say that besides our users route here, we also want to be able to load a single user, so to load the user component, which simply, well, gives us that single user. For that, we might want to load a user dynamically, because if we have a look at our users component, we see we get 3 users with different IDs. So it would be nice if we could pass the ID of the user we want to load in that route path. One approach would be to set up a route with user 1 and then one with user 2, and it doesn't look very optimal because it's not very dynamic, and still, how would we know inside of this component which route was loaded? Okay, we could parse the path manually, but that's not really a great approach. Instead, we can add parameters to our routes, dynamic segments in our paths. We do this by adding a colon and then any name you like for example ID. You will later be able to retrieve the parameter inside of the loaded component by that name you specify here, so by ID in this case. And the colon simply tells Angular that this is a dynamic part of the path. Without colon, only routes which are users/ID, and with ID I literally mean the word ID, would lead to this component. With a colon, users/anything else would load this component, and anything else would be interpreted as the ID. Now with this in place, we are able to load a component, the user component, with this dynamic piece sent to it. So if we have a look to this user component or at this user component, here we simply say user with ID, and now we simply have a dummy text here loaded and user name with some dummy text here. Now, for now, we won't touch this. We won't use this parameter. We will do this in the next lecture. Let's now see if we successfully reach this. So if we save this to let it recompile and we go back, we are in users. Let's add /something here. And you see the single user component was loaded. The same if we add /1 here. So this thing, the segment after /users, is indeed interpreted as dynamic. Otherwise, we would get the error that users/1 is an unknown route. It isn't, because we set it up to be a known one, because again, we added this dynamic path segment here. Now this is how we can dynamically load some route, how we can encode some data into our path. How can we get access to this data in the loaded component though? Because that, of course, is another key question. Let's take a closer look in the next lecture. In the last lecture, we created our route with a dynamic path segment. Now we want to get access to the data the user sent us, or which is encoded in the URL, I should say. So we know that we will load the user component, this one here, and we know that there will be some data in the URL for us. How can we get access to it? Well, it is in the TypeScript file where we can get access, And there we need to inject something we already injected before, the active route. So this is again on activated route, so make sure to use this type and import it from @AngularRouter. And by injecting this, we get access to the currently loaded route. Now I told you that this currently loaded route is a JavaScript object with a lot of metadata about this currently loaded route. One of these important pieces of information is the currently active user. Now you see that in this user component, I already defined a user object at the top, which is undefined for now. It should have the following structure, and it's not used right now. But we could load our user by simply, well, getting access or retrieving this parameter from our URL. So it would be nice if, let's say, in ng-on-init, when our component gets initialized, we get our user. So we maybe want to say this user equals, and now we assign it to a JavaScript object because that is the type of it, a JavaScript object with an ID and with a name. Now the value for the ID can be fetched from our route, and there we have a snapshot property, and on this snapshot of our currently active route, we have a params JavaScript object, and here we can get our ID. And now you will only have access to properties here, well, which you defined in your route parameters. So this part here, we named it ID here, so we can retrieve the ID from this params object here. Now the name is something which is not encoded in the route right now. So maybe we should do this too. Let's go to app module and let's simply add another dynamic part here, :name. Now we also will get this as a parameter, so we can retrieve it the same way we retrieve the ID. Let's retrieve the name. And it's in the same params object because this is all part of the route which was loaded due to this path we set up in app module being triggered, which holds two dynamic pieces. And you can add as many parameters here as you want. They will all be retrievable on this params object of the loaded route. With that, we assign something to our user. Now we could go to our HTML document and output that data. So with string interpolation, here we could output user ID. It will now be set, we know that. And username maybe. Both will be available because we set it in ng-on-init. Now this should work, so if we save this and we target /users1 max maybe, so that we have both the ID and the name, and we hit enter, we correctly see ID 1, name max. If we change the ID to 3, we see ID 3 here. So this seems to work, and you even see that this is still marked as active because this currently active path still contains /users, which was the route for this link. So this router link active directive is still doing its job. Now this seems to be working fine. Now let me add something to it which will break it though. I'll do this in the next lecture. In the last lecture we saw how we can retrieve our route parameters and it was working fine, but there are ways to break this. There are cases where this approach will not work, and I will show you a typical example. On our users component, we right now always saw that we have the user ID and name we passed on our URL. Now in here, let me quickly add a router link. So I'll add a horizontal line and then add an anchor tag where I remove the ref and instead say router link. And now I will actually use this syntax with the squared brackets where I pass an array. And I want to load /users, an absolute path to load the correct route. The second element will be the ID. So this might be, let's say 10, could be a number, could be a string. And then the name, let's say Anna. So this will now construct a route which is /users/10/Anna. And this is where this array approach might be better because you can really structure this really well, and we will soon see how you can even make this more dynamic. So here I will say load Anna, ID 10, something like that, any text you like. And now let's see this here. We got this link on our currently loaded page with users 3 max. And if I click this, you see that the URL was updated. Now it's users 10 Anna, but the text here wasn't. And this is not a bug. This is the default behavior. And what is happening here? Do you have an idea? The behavior here, as I just mentioned, is not a bug. We load our data by using this snapshot object on the route. Now, if we load a new route, what happens? Angular has a look at our app module, finds the fitting route here, hopefully, loads the component, initializes the component, and gives us the data by accessing the snapshot here. Now, that only happens if we haven't been on this component before. But if we click this link, which is on the user component, well, then the URL still changes, but we already are on the component which should get loaded. So Angular, cleverly, doesn't reinstantiate this component. That would only cost us performance. Why would it re-render a component we already are on? Now you might say, because the data we want to load changed. But Angular doesn't know. And it's good that by default, it won't recreate the whole component and destroy the old one if we already are on that component. Still, of course, you want to get access to the updated data. And you can. It's fine to use the snapshot for the first initialization. But to be able to react to subsequent changes, we need a different approach. In our TypeScript code in ng-on-init here, let's say after we assigned this initial setup, we can use our route object, and instead of using the snapshot here, there is some params property on this route object itself. Now we didn't use that before, we had the snapshot in between. What's the difference? Params here is an observable. And now observables is something I will come to right after this section where we will take a closer look. Basically, observables are a feature added by some other third-party package, not by Angular, but heavily used by Angular, which allow you to easily work with asynchronous tasks. And this is an asynchronous task, because the parameters of your currently loaded route might change at some point in the future if the user clicks this link, but you don't know when, you don't know if, and you don't know how long it will take. So therefore, you can't block your code and wait for this to happen here, because it might never happen. So an observable is an easy way to subscribe to some event which might happen in the future, to then execute some code when it happens, without having to wait for it now. And that is what params is. It is such an observable, and as the name implies, we can observe it, and we do so by subscribing to it. So you can call the subscribe method on it, and this is still called on params. I'm just bringing it in a new line to make it easier to read. And now subscribe can take 3 functions you pass here as arguments. Now the first one is the most important one here. It will be fired whenever new data is sent through that observable. So to put it in easier words, whenever the parameters change in this use case. So then, this first argument, which should be a function here, is executed. I will use a ES6 arrow function, and here we will get the updated params as an argument, and you can set this of type params, doesn't really make a difference. It has to be imported from @AngularRouter then though. But anyways, params will always be an object, just like here on the snapshot, which holds the parameters you defined in the route as properties. So in the function body of this arrow function, so of this function which gets executed whenever the parameter changes, here we can now update our user object. And we can say this user ID should now be params ID, referring to the params we passed here. And the same, of course, for the name. Oops, with a semicolon at the end, of course. So this will now update our user object whenever the parameter change. That's why it's inside of this callback and of this anonymous function passed to the subscribe method here. This code will not be executed when ng-on-init runs through. This code here will, so the subscription will be set up, but only if the parameters then change. Only in this case, we will exchange them in our user object. That is why with this change in place, if we now go back to free and max, we see free and max is displayed here. But if I now click this link, it correctly updates here too, because our observable fires, and we then retrieve the updated parameters and assign them to our user object. And this therefore actually is the approach you should take to be really safe against changes not being reflected in your template. Now, if you know that the component you're on may never be reloaded from within that component, as we're doing it here, then you might not need this addition. You might simply use the snapshot, because if you know your component will 100% of the time be recreated when it is reached, because there's no other way of reaching it, there is no way of reaching it whilst being on that component. If you know that, you don't need to subscribe. In all other cases, make sure to use this approach to get informed about any changes in your route parameters. In the last lecture, we learned how we can subscribe to our params to update them or to react to any changes to them and update our page if we already are on that page. Now we set up this subscription using observables, and this works fine, and you don't have to change anything here. I want to bring something to your attention though. The fact that you don't have to add anything else to this component here simply is because Angular does something for you in the background, which is super important. It cleans up the subscription you set up here whenever this component is destroyed. Because if it wouldn't do this, what are you doing here? You're subscribing to parameter changes, and let's say you then leave this component, and later you come back. Well, once you left, this component will be destroyed, and when you come back, a new one will be created. But this subscription here will always live on in memory because it's not closely tied to your component. So if the component is destroyed, the subscription won't. Now, it will be here because Angular handles this destroying of the subscription for you, but theoretically, you might want to implement the onDestroy lifecycle hook, importing it from @Angular core. Therefore, you have to implement ng onDestroy. And then you could store this subscription here in some property. Let's name it params subscription, which will be of type subscription. And subscription needs to be imported from RxJS subscription. RxJS is the package offering all this observables functionality. As I mentioned, it's not shipping with Angular, but Angular is using this package. So this type here, this subscription, this param subscription property is now bound to this subscription we're setting up here when calling subscribe. This returns us this subscription. And once the component gets destroyed, we could now access the subscription and unsubscribe. And again, because it's important, you don't have to do this. You can leave it as it was before, because Angular will do this for you regarding these route observables. But if you add your own observables, and I will come back to this in the observables section following this section, you have to unsubscribe on your own. And I just wanted to bring it to your attention because it's always super important to understand what's happening behind the scenes. Again, it's not necessary here, but it doesn't hurt to also do it manually too here. It won't add anything bad to your app by doing it like this. In the last lecture, we learned how we can retrieve our route params. That's awesome, and this is super important and something you will probably use a lot. Now, there are more things you can add to your URL though. You might have query parameters. These are the parameters separated by a question mark, like mode equals editing, anything. And you can have multiple ones separated with @signs. The question now is how can you pass them using Angular links, router links, and how can you then retrieve them? You might also have a hash fragment, so separated with the hash sign to jump to a specific place in your app, loading, for example. Or maybe you don't really want to use this to jump there. You would have to add this scroll down there behavior on your own. Maybe you just want to retrieve it to use it as some extra information. Let's take a closer look at how we can pass this extra information on our links, both when using the router link directive and the navigate method in code, and how we can then retrieve that information. Let's start by passing it first. Let's say in our app module, we want to add more routes. For our servers here, we also want to add one other route, and that would be the route which allows us to edit a certain server. So we might load a server with some ID and then have /added at the end to describe in the URL what will happen in this component. And here it would be the added server component we want to load. So we added this new route, which should load this component in this added server file. Now, to be able to load this route on my servers component here, I want to hook up these links here in this list. We still have to do the same for the users component later. So here, I will add my router link and I will use the squared bracket syntax again so that I can pass an array here because I want to go to /servers. Then let's say server with ID 5. We will soon learn how to make this more dynamic. And then also add it. So this is this newly created route I want to call in this case. If we save this and we go to servers and click on this, you see we loaded servers 5 added, and the same for every link, of course. Again, I will change this soon. Now let's say we also want to have some query parameter deciding on whether we are allowed to edit the server or not. So we want to add this question mark, and we don't do it by adding question mark equals something here as another element in this array. Instead, when using a link in a template, we add a new property of this router link directive. We can bind to the query params property. Now, query params, and that's important, is not a new directive. It's just another bindable property of the router link directive. And here we have to pass a JavaScript object. And on query params, we can now define key value pairs of the parameters we want to edit. So for example, say allow edit here and set this to 1. Now let's see what happens if we now click this link. If we now click any link here, you see we have question mark allow edit 1 here. So that's this key value pair we set up in this object. And of course you could have more key value pairs here, which would then be separated with the and sign in between in your link. So that's the query params property. We also have the fragment property, and that is only fragment because you may only have one fragment. Here you could simply pass a string with single quotation marks or therefore omit the squared brackets and set this to, let's say, loading. So if we now save this, we go back to the servers page. Now you see we have hash loading at the end. This is how you can add a fragment. So super easy to add in our router link here in our template. Let's now see how we can do the same programmatically. So in our home component where we already have this load servers button, let's say we want to load server 1. So here I will change this name to load server and pass 1 as an argument maybe. Adjust this method here, load server, and the ID will be passed as an argument as we just saw. And here I therefore want to navigate to servers, pass the ID. We're already seeing how this gets more dynamic. Now we're not hard coding 5 or something like this. We're using this argument here instead. And then as a last argument, edit. Now again, we still want to add query params and this fragment. So here in the navigate method, we use this object we already saw where we already added relative to. Now I don't need relative to here. Instead here, I can also set up my query params. And that again is then just a JavaScript object where we say allow edit and set this to 1 maybe. And just as I added query params, I can also add the fragment here and set this to loading. Now with this, if we save this and we go back to our home page and click load server, you see we add the query parameter, allow edit and set it equal to 1, and the hash fragment here. So that is how we can use query parameters and fragments on both the programmatical routing approach, calling it from the TypeScript code, or on the router link like here. Now let's also learn how we can retrieve the data thereafter. In the last lecture we learned how we can pass query parameters and fragments. Now let's make sure we can also retrieve them. So we're loading this added server component in the end. So that is probably where we want to retrieve that information. We can easily do this by going there, edit server component, and you see there already is a lot of code in there. Well, everything what's happening here, however, is it's using our service to get the server with the ID 1 and to be able to update it. And definitely dive into this service file if you want to learn more about what's happening here. It's super simple though. We simply are able to get this array of servers, get a single server, or update a single server, so overwrite it. So that's not the interesting part. The interesting part in the edit server component here is how we can get access to our query parameter and the fragment. We need our activated route for this, so let's inject it just like we did before. Activated route needs to be imported from the @Angular router package, so make sure to add this import at the top. And with this added, and let's say ng on init, we can retrieve our query parameters and the fragment. And just like before, there are two ways of retrieving it. For the first approach, we can simply access the snapshot of our route and access query params here or our fragment. Just like that. Now this might bring the same problem as with the params. This is only run or updated at the time this component is created. So if there is a chance of changing your query params from the page you're currently on, you might not want to use this approach because it won't be reactive, it won't display or allow you to react to any changes which happen after this component has been loaded. So for now, let's use the snapshot though. And let's watch the console once this reloads. Notice we already have a query parameter and a fragment. And we see both here. This is our query parameter object, where we have this key value pair mapping again, allow added to 1. And this is just a bit broken, but here you see if I make my console a bit broader, you see the loading hash fragment. So this is how you can retrieve it. The alternative, of course, is to use the route, and just like we had params as observable, we also have query params as an observable we can subscribe to, like this. And of course, we also have fragment as an observable we can subscribe to. So just like before, this will now allow you to react to changed query parameters. Now that's something we will use later in this module. For now, nothing will happen here, but it is important to keep in mind, like for params, you do have the same for query params and fragment. You don't need to unsubscribe here. Angular will handle it for you, just like it did for params. But this is how you can now get access to these extra features and how you can make sure that you don't miss the data. So now that we learned a lot about navigating passing parameters, let's improve our app a little bit by going to the users component, where we have a list of links in the end to single users. And let's add the router link here, pass an array as an argument. And here we want to target /users, and we already created our route, right? We have /users /id and /name. So we can use that information here in the users component. The second element here in this array therefore should be the ID. And since we have a for loop where we loop through all our users, we can easily dynamically add the ID here by accessing user ID. And the same for the name, the third element, the third segment in this path, the username, we can access username. This is how we can dynamically construct such a link. And you already saw this with the navigate method a couple of lectures earlier. So this is our router link here. Let's do the same for the servers. So here in the servers component, let's also replace the 5 here with server ID. We do have a server ID if we have a look at the service, service. You see we have IDs and names here. So we want to pass the ID, and we can now do this by dynamically fetching it here. And I will remove added though, because I not only want to load the added component here, I want to load this single server component instead. With my link added here, we need to add the fitting route. So in our app module here, we need to add another route where we have servers and then just ID to load a single server with the server component here. Right now we're always loading the added server component, so make sure to add this extra route. And of course, this will be loaded because we removed the added at the end. So we're not editing this anymore. This just loads the single component. And of course now, in this single server component, this one here, where we want to output our server data, we need to get that data we pass in the route path in the URL. We pass the ID there. We do have a server's service where we are able to get a server by ID, and we already do this in our server component here in Engion init. Right now, always for the server with the ID 1. So now use your chance to update this code to do this with the ID being passed with our route. You learned everything you need for this. Time for you to do it on your own. I will give you the chance to pause this video before we do this together. So, were you successful? Let's try it together. Of course, to get access to the route parameter, we need to inject our activated route. So we learned how to do this. Add this route property and make it of type activated route, which you need to import from @AngularRouter. And now in Engion init, you can get your ID from this activated route from the snapshot, the params object here, and then the ID, which is encoded in the URL. And now you can use this ID here to get that server. Now, if you also want to react to any changes thereafter, you need to subscribe to your params observable here and basically do the same. You get the params here, which is of type params. Make sure to import that from @AngularRouter. And once you get this, you can get a new server whenever your params should change. So here you could then access params ID like this to update the server whenever it changes triggered on this page. So with this in place, if we reload our app and go to servers, you see we get an error here, which makes sense because keep in mind on our servers component here, we still are always loading our single server component. And therefore we are also loading it if we don't have this ID available. So for now, I will comment this out. We will soon learn how we can nest another router in there to have some kind of child routing to load this route dynamically next to our menu here. So for now, I simply commented it out. If I now click on a server here, we still get an error. And now this can be a tricky one to spot. What's going wrong here? The issue is if we parse a parameter from our URL, it will always be a string because our whole URL is simply just text. So ID here will actually not be 1 in the case of /1, it will be a string of 1. So if we try to get a server by this ID, it will actually search a server which has an ID of 1 but a string 1. However, we use numbers here. So we simply have to make sure to convert our ID to a number, and we can do this by adding a plus in front of it. And this is perfectly fine to do with that you're making sure that the ID you're retrieving is treated as a number. Of course, you also need to make sure to do this here in your observable. So convert the params here to a number too. So with that, if we now click on servers and choose a server, you see production server here, test server in this case, and with that, this is now working as expected. We now improved our app because now we got working links here, we got working links here, and we're loading the correct server. So with that, we added a lot, but we see that our app has some limitations. It would be nice if we don't load a new page with the user or the server here, but load it next to our menu in both cases. So we somehow need some nested routing, some child routes kind of, to have a router inside a router. Let's have a closer look at this in the next lectures. We improved our app quite a bit, but the issue we have is that if we click on a server or a user, we load a brand new page. It would be nicer if we would load it next to this menu. So we need some nested routing. We can also see that in the app module, we kind of have some duplication here. All these routes here start with servers and all these routes with users. So it would be nice to nest them and to have some child routes which all start with servers then here, in this case for example. Let's add such child routes. To do this, I'll go to my servers component route, to the /servers route, and I'll add another property, children. Children takes another array of routes. So now I can simply take my two other servers routes here and add them inside of this array as children. Now, servers should now be removed because that is now always prepended at the beginning anyways. So we have to make sure to get rid of it here. And now we have just ID and ID added. So this is now already better because now we group that together. It gives us more than this visual grouping here though. You notice that on the servers here, we have the servers component as the, well, component to be loaded still. The question now is, where will the server component be loaded then? Because that is yet another child route of our servers component. And you can see that this is an issue. If we reload our app here, everything's working. If I click on test server, now we get an error. Because now the error tells us that it cannot find an outlet to load our server component in. And indeed it can't, because the only router outlet, the only hook in our code where it should load components, is in our app component here. Now that is reserved for all our routes on the top level. So /nothing, /users, users ID name, and servers. But the child routes of servers need a separate outlet because they can't override the servers component. Instead, they should be loaded nested into this servers component. And that actually is the behavior we want. So we can quickly get there by going to the servers component HTML file. And here where we load the edit page or the app server page, well, here I will simply comment out all that code and instead add a router outlet here. This now adds a new hook which will be used on all child routes of the route being loaded on the servers component, which of course is our /servers route here. So all these child routes will be loaded in this router outlet place now. So if we save this and now we let this reload, you don't see anything here, but if I click a server, it's now loaded next to the menu because this is where we added our second router outlet. And this is how you can easily add child routes. Let's do the same for the user routes now. In the app module, I'll add children here, so this property which takes an array of routes. And I only have one nested route here, but that's fine, so I will add it here. Get rid of the users at the beginning, just have then the ID and name, the two dynamic parameters, and load the user component. And now in my users component HTML file, I'll replace my app user here with another router outlet where all the user related child routes, or the one user related child route we have, will be loaded. So if we save this, you now see we load the user next to it. And that is why it is super important to dynamically update the ID and so on, because the component wasn't exchanged. We were able to switch the loaded user while this old component, the user component, the single user component, was already loaded. And this is how you can implement child routing, nested routes, with this children property, which then holds all the nested routes. In the last lecture, we added child routing. Let's now improve this app a little bit more. In our servers component, we have our links loading the individual servers, so the single server component, this component here, with this allow edit query parameter. So now in the server component, we should add some button where we say edit server, because right now we got no way of reaching the edit server component besides manually typing this route here, this path here, into our URL. So let's add a button to the server component. I'll add some CSS classes to make this look nice. And of course, I'll add a click listener where I say on edit. Now again, this is on a single server component. So here I'll add the on edit method. And in here, I now want to navigate to the edit server component. We learned how to do this. We need to get access to the router so that we are able to call the navigate method. So let's inject it. Make sure to also add the import from @AngularRouter. And with that injected in onEdit, we can navigate You learned how to do this, so maybe a time to pause the video and try it on your own. This is how I would do it. I would call my router. Then of course we have the navigate method, and here we need to pass an array. And we simply want to append added to the end of the currently loaded route. So you could of course also use /servers, the relative path, then use the ID of the currently loaded server again, server ID, and then append added. But since we already are on this path, why not just use a relative route and just use added? Now you learned if you want to use a relative route, a relative path here, when using the navigate method, you need to set up the relative to property here on the second argument, on this object you can pass to navigate, and reference the currently loaded route so that the Angular router knows to which route you want to navigate relatively. So with this, we should load the /added route, we should append it to the end of our currently loaded route. Let's see if this works. If we go to servers, click on a server and click on added, we load the added server page. And now here we want to control on whether the user is allowed to update to edit the server or not. The issue is, you see, we theoretically have our query params here, allow edit, always set to 1 in this case. But we lose this information as soon as we click edit server. So that is something we need to fix before we can use the information there. We will fix it in the next lecture. Before doing so, let's implement the rest of the logic though. Let's say here on the servers component, where we set the allow added query parameter, we don't always want to set this to 1, to true therefore. We want to decide on whether we want to allow the editing depending on the server ID, let's say. So only if the server ID equals 3, let's say, only in this case we want to allow edit. So we want to set it to 1, otherwise we will set it to 0. So that's just a ternary expression checking the server ID, and if it's not equal to 3, we will set it to 0. So we will set the allow edit parameter to 0. That's the first step. Now in added server, of course, we want to be able to retrieve our query params. So here we already get the subscribe method on the query params. Now here I want to determine on whether we are allowed to edit or not. So I will add a new allow edit property here and set it to false initially. But whenever this changes here in the query parameters, I want to get my query params, which are also of type params, to be imported from @AngularRouter. And then here in the method body, I will set this allow edit equal to my query params here, equal to the allow edit ID or property we set there. And now this either is 1, string of 1, of course you could also pass true as a string here, in which case I want to set allow edit to true. If it is not 1, I will set it to false though. And in the template of this component, we could simply add a heading, let's say, where we say you're not allowed to edit if, and we can use ngIf for this, if allow edit is false, so if not allow edit, and we wrap all the rest in a new div, so all this part here, only if it is true. And now all of a sudden we would control this, but again the issue is if we click on added server, our query params disappear, so it is always in the you're not allowed to edit mode. Let's fix it in the next lecture. Let's see how we can actually preserve our query params once we navigate again. So in the last lecture we tried to improve our application a bit more, but the issue is our query parameters are gone whenever we navigate away from our single server component to the added server component, for example. So we want to preserve them because we already set this information at the point of time we visit a single server. Now we want to preserve this information once we navigate one step further to the added server component. To preserve that information, we got a simple way of doing so. In the server component where we navigate, we can pass another property or add another property to this JavaScript object we use to configure our navigation. And here we get the query params handling property. Now query params handling takes a string as a value, and this could be merge to merge our old query params with any new we might add here. Now we don't add any new ones, so we can simply choose preserve instead. And preserve, which will override the default behavior, which is to simply drop them, and make sure that the old ones are kept. Now if we were to add new ones here, the old ones would actually override the new ones, so we should use merge in this case. But since we don't add new ones, preserve should make sure that we don't lose them. So now if we click on this again and click edit server, now you'll see allow edit equal to 0 is still set. And therefore on the dev server, where it is set to 1 if we click edit server, we do see the edit menu again. So query params handling here, super important, super useful to know to make sure you don't lose the information you had before. Whoa, you already learned a lot about routing. We're nearing the end. But did you ever wonder what happens if we enter something here which we don't cover? Like let's say it's just slash something? We get an error because clearly we don't have a route with slash something here. So that is something we probably want to improve. We want to do some 404 error handling. We maybe want to redirect the user to a specific page whenever he tries to visit a page we don't have. These are the topics I'll focus on next. Setting up a route which handles all routes we don't have set up, and redirecting requests. Not necessarily two topics you use together, but also not that uncommon. So let's start with redirecting. Let's say we add a new component to our application, and I will use the CLI for this with the GC for generate component command, and I'll name it page not found. The page not found component, which was added here in our app folder, in this new page not found folder. I'll get rid of the spec file, and here I will simply say in the template, this page was not found. Something like this. Now I want to render this page in, let's say, the case that we visit a certain route. I'll add it here at the bottom, where the path is, for now, something. And in this something case here, I want to load my page not found component. Of course, make sure that you added it to declarations and so on, because we're still using it in our app, of course. So with this in place, if we now save this, go back to our application and visit slash something, we of course see this page was not found. Now let's change something to not found, and let's make sure that once we add another new route, which then is something, let's say, we don't also have to add component here, but we redirect to another route, to the not found route maybe. For this, we got another property we can add to any route config here, so of course also to any of the other routes. If you don't want to specify a component to load, you can say redirect to. Now this is an alternative to component. Component loads the specific component, redirect to redirects to another path. So here you can specify any path, and the path maybe now is slash not found. So now if you do this, you see that it automatically redirected. So let me show you this again by typing slash something, watch the URL. It redirects to slash not found. And all the other routes, of course, still work. So this is how we can use redirection. Now, of course, it's not very convenient to define slash something here because you probably can't define all possible wrong URLs the user can enter. So a more convenient way to catch all routes which are not covered by your app is to use the double asterisk route here. This is the wildcard route, which means catch all paths you don't know. And the order is super important here. Make sure that this very generic route is the last one in your array of routes, because your routes get parsed from top to bottom here. So if this was actually at the beginning, you would always get redirected as I can quickly show you by saving this like this, now no matter where you click, you always are redirected to not found. So make sure this is the last route here in your setup. And with this, now all the other routes work, but if you enter anything invalid here, you always get redirected to not found, because now you're using this wildcard route, catching all routes which are unknown to Angular at this point of time once it reaches this line here, and which then redirects to the not found route, which displays the page not found page or component. This is how you can redirect and make sure you catch routes you're not covering right now. Whew, so a lot was covered. Let's dive even deeper. If we have a look at our application, our app module, you already see that the routing takes up some significant space in our app module. So typically, if you have more than, let's say, 2 or 3 routes, you don't add it directly in the app module. Instead, you add a new file, which is for the application as a whole, typically is called app routing module. So the apps-routing.module.ts file now will hold a second module. And I will have a whole module course section about Angular modules later in the course. There we will dive much deeper and learn how you can define and use multiple modules, use them together. This is a super easy use case here, so let's add it now. Here I will give this a name of app routing module, because that is what it is, and it receives this @ng module decorator. So this is configured with a JavaScript object being passed to it, and this will be a super simple module. Now, as mentioned, I will dive deeper into this later. You can basically build your Angular app from multiple modules. This simple module here will handle all our routing related tasks. So I will cut all my routes, this app routes constant, and add it in there. Of course, now I need to make sure that all these imports here are added. So make sure to add all the imports to all these components, and also, of course, here to routes from the @Angular router package. And you don't need to add declarations here, because these components already are declared in your app module, and we will soon add the app routing module to this root module. So no need to redeclare them. This would actually even give you an error. We also have to remove the router module from here, from our root module. Therefore, we can remove the imports from the router package. Make sure to import router module in your app routing module now. So to add this import here. And now we need to configure something in ng module. We basically want to add imports again. We had this in the app module too. And in imports, we want to use this router module, use for root as before, and pass our routes array to it. So just like we did before. But that alone is not enough now, because as I mentioned, we simply want to use this app routing module to outsource our routes. Therefore, we need to add our app routing module back to our main module. And for this, we need to add the exports array here. And I just can mention it again. We will dive deeper into modules later in the course. Exports simply tells Angular, hey, from this module, if I were to add this module to the imports of another module, what should be accessible to this module which imports this module? And the one thing we want to make accessible is our router module. Now here you don't call for root, because you did this here. So in the first step you configured this router module, added your own routes to it. Now we simply export this configured router module. And therefore in app module, we can now import our own app routing module. So here on the imports array, we can simply add app routing module. Make sure to add the import path here. And with that, we have the same setup as before, but with a bit of a leaner app module and our routing functionality outsourced in this separate module, which is kind of a good practice to do to keep your files organized and easy to read. So, same behavior as before. If we save this with ngserve still running, we should therefore see that everything still works, and this looks good to me. But again, important to understand, now with a different setup, a bit more readable and a good practice to implement if your application grows more complex. Throughout this section, you learn a lot about routing. You know how to set up routes, to load them both through router link or programmatically, how to pass params, query params, how to use the data, how to load different components, and much more. One important feature is left in this module, which I definitely want to cover: route guards. So basically, functionality, logic, code, which is executed before a route is loaded or once you want to leave a route. Let's start with a simple use case. Let's say you only want to give access to your server component, your single server component, or the added server component if a user is logged in. Now, we're not going to add a full login functionality. For this, we will later have the authentication section in this course, but we will fake it for now. Still, we want to check this before any of our sub-routes here, so servers 3, servers 1, and then also the added routes are accessed. Now, manually checking this in the onInit function of our server and added server component would be very cumbersome, because you would have to add it in both components, and if you add more components belonging to the server's feature, you would have to add this over and over again. So therefore, we want to use a feature built into the Angular router running some code before a component is loaded. We will use the canActivateGuard, and we will do so in the next lecture. As mentioned in the last lecture, we want to maybe protect some of our routes. And we can use a feature offered by Angular which allows us to run some code at a point of time defined by us. I will add a new file in our root folder and I will name it offguard.service.ts because the code we run there is stored in such a service. I'll name it offguard though because the feature of the Angular router is called guards. It guards certain actions like navigating to, around, or away from it. But in the end, it is a normal service, and therefore, as such, I will export a class which I'll name offguard. Now, you could add service here to be fully in line with all the other services, but since we will only use this as a guard, I will leave it at the offguard name. And now here, I will implement the canActivate interface. This interface is provided by the Angular router package, so you need to import it, and it forces you to have a canActivate method in this class. The canActivate method now will receive two arguments: the activated route snapshot and the state of the router, so the router state snapshot. So make sure to also add these imports at the top here from @AngularRouter and to add them here as types for the two parameters we get in canActivate. Now you might ask, where are we getting these arguments from? Keep in mind, we will soon define that Angular should execute this code before a route is loaded, so it will give us this data, and we simply need to be able to handle the data. So that is canActivate with the arguments it requires. canActivate also returns something. It either returns an observable, so make sure to import observable from RxJS. Observable is the correct path in this case. This observable then will wrap a boolean, so it will in the end resolve to a true or false value. Alternatively, this route returns a promise, also returning the boolean in the end, or it returns just a boolean. So canActivate can run both asynchronously, returning an observable or a promise, or synchronously, because you might have some guards which execute some code which runs completely on the client, therefore it runs synchronously, or you might have some code which takes a couple of seconds to finish because you use a timeout in there, or you reach out to a server, so it runs asynchronously. And both is possible with can activate. You will see an example in a second. So here we want to be able to log in or out. For this, let's say we have another service, the auth service. And this is just a fake service here. So I will name it auth service, and in a real application this might reach out to a server and allow us to log in or log out and check our current authentication state. I will track the state here too with the logged in property, which is set to false initially, and then I'll add a login method which will set logged in to true, just like this, and a logout method which will set logged in to false to again fake this behavior. And I will have a method which allows us to check the state, authenticate it. And here I want to simulate that this takes some time to finish because maybe we reach out to a server. Therefore here I will return a promise, a new promise therefore. This promise will as always take a method, a function as an argument with the resolve and reject methods we can execute. And in this promise here I will execute set timeout to wait, let's say, 800 milliseconds, and then execute another method in which I will resolve the promise and return this logged in. Again, just to fake that this takes a couple of seconds to finish, or some time to finish. So, with this auth service added, I now want to use it in my auth guard. And as this is also just a service, we need to add injectable to be able to reach out to the other service to inject that service into this guard. So make sure to import add injectable from Angular core. And then I will add a constructor to my auth guard where I reach out to my fake auth service here of type auth service. Therefore make sure to add this import too. And now in the can activate guard, I simply want to check whether the user is logged in or not. So here I can reach out to my auth service to the isAuthenticated method, which again, keep in mind, returns a promise. Well, therefore we should return this promise here, I guess. So it returns us this promise. And here, I then want to be able to handle that whenever this promise in the auth service resolves. I know that there I will get back a boolean. So this authentication state, this logged in boolean is what we resolve here in the end. And this could be false or true. So I know that I will get back a boolean. And here I then want to check if this is true, in which case I want to return true. And otherwise, I want to navigate away because I don't want to allow the user access to the route he wanted to go to originally. I will navigate away to force the user to go somewhere else. So I will inject the Angular router for this because this is how we can navigate with the navigate method. Make sure to add the import from @AngularRouter. And then here we can navigate with the navigate method. And let's say we just want to go back to our root page with just /. So in this case, our can activate method will navigate away. And I will now simply return this promise it still is in the end. Because if we return something inside of the promise, it will give us back another promise. So now we're returning a promise here, which gives us back true, or simply navigates us away, canceling the old navigation anyways, therefore. So this now allows us to control access to whatever is controlled by this can activate guard here. Now, we're still not using this guard, of course. So to use it, I'll go to my app routing module